Jeffrey S. Kaye is a retired psychologist who had a long-time private practice in San Francisco, California. He's written on topics concerning U.S. policy on torture and on political topics in general for online publications including Alternate, The Guardian, Truth Out, and several others. He has his own blog at valtinsblog.blogspot.com, and he's the author of a new book, or a book in the second edition, called Cover Up at Guantanamo, the NCIS investigation into the suicides of Mohammed Al Hanashi and Abdul Rahman Al Amri. In 2007, at the American Psychological Association Convention in San Francisco, he spoke about the history of psychological research into sensory deprivation and its utilization by the U.S. government for purposes of interrogation and torture. Dr. Kaye's research utilizing Freedom of Information Act requests led to the 2014 declassification of a less redacted version of the CIA's classic KU BARC interrogation/torture manual. So thank you, Jeffrey, for speaking with me today.
Dave, thank you very much. Happy to do so.
So I guess let's start. Guantanamo Bay was opened quite a while ago, and it's been under now 3 different administrations. Can we talk about some of the basics of Guantanamo Bay? When did Bush open it, and what was the purpose of it back then?
Right. Well, the detention camp part of Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, which was essentially stolen from Cuba decades ago, in the early 20th century. But the detention camp that we know of when we speak of Guantanamo was opened in January of 2002, and reportedly the first detainees arrived. These were from Afghanistan and the war going on there on January 11th, 2002. But discussion, obviously there was a ramp up to that, and what happened was the Bush administration and their attorneys were looking for a place to, as they put it, put the detainees that they were capturing on the battlefield, and where they could be outside the reach of U.S. law. And because they had determined that they were, and they worked this out kind of as they went along, but who knows exactly when exactly and how far back it goes. But anyway, they had determined after September 11th that the detainees they caught would not be privileged, which is a legal term. In other words, they would not be subject to prisoner of war rules set by the Geneva Conventions after World War II. And this they knew was going to be problematic in the eyes of the international community and perhaps even by U.S. law. So they looked for a place where they could stow these prisoners that they felt would be beyond the reach of law. And what they came up with was Guantanamo. And that's where the first prisoners arrived. Although I'll note, and this is in my book that you mentioned, Cover Up at Guantanamo, that even the story we have about the very first days of Guantanamo are shrouded in secrecy and lies. And what I discovered some years ago when I was researching aspects of the Guantanamo story was that, in fact, and your listeners may be surprised to hear this, detainees arriving in the very first days at Guantanamo died. We don't know how many, but died of supposedly and reportedly actually by an official U.S. Army source or Armed Forces source from the battlefield wounds they had sustained. So they took, and the United States government admits that injured prisoners were arriving at Guantanamo. They claimed that heroic attempts were made medically to save their lives, and they were saved. But in fact, behind closed doors at meetings of the Armed Forces Epidemiological Board later in 2002, an assistant to a rear admiral told the assorted other military and CDC officials who were there that prisoners had in fact died. But this has never been reported by the press. I've reported it, but it's gone unmentioned by literally anybody else, except I believe by Andy Worthington, who picked up the fact that I reported this. Andy Worthington's a reporter in Britain who has long reported on Guantanamo. But it just goes to show you just how much is unknown, even about the early days of Guantanamo. I will mention in passing that I was able to secure confirmation from another source that, in fact, who sadly will not go in the record. So I can't, I'm not publishing it because it's not on the record. But your listeners would just have to believe me. But they do have other sources that have corroborated that prisoners died in the very first days at Guantanamo, not of suicide, but of wounds sustained on the battlefield, and then they were brought there. So anyway, that's the beginning of Guantanamo.
And it became such a, I guess, a black spot on America's reputation that Obama promised to close it down. Can you talk about, did Obama have any success in changing? Obviously, we know he didn't close it, but was he able to affect any changes of what was going on there?
The Obama administration seems to have affected some very small changes about what was going on. Certainly one of the changes that is attributed to him, but in fact shouldn't be, is that that they stopped having prisoners sent to Guantanamo. But really that happened in the closing days of the Bush administration. So that for the most part, really, the Obama, most famously gave an executive order stopping torture by the CIA and also by the U.S. military at places like Guantanamo and other sites. The black sites had already, in fact, been shut down by the CIA a few years even earlier than before Obama came into office. But, did Obama really shut down torture? And I could spend the whole show just on this one question. But no, he did not. He did stop certain types of torture, or at least order them to stop taking place. These were the types of torture that had been most famous, made the headlines around waterboarding and, the types of so-called enhanced interrogation techniques attributed to the CIA psychologist Mitchell and Jessen, who had earlier worked for the military's SEER program. SEER trains people to resist torture, but they used the very techniques in which they inoculated students against torture to, in fact, be used as torture. So, Obama, and I mentioned there was during the Obama administration, the Department of Defense issued an directive, an official directive, saying that no SEER techniques would ever be used, should not be used ever in torture again. But and here's a way that I'd like your listeners to understand just how much we are in Alice in Wonderland territory here, how much we are down the rabbit hole, as they say. That no matter what you hear, the people in charge are very manipulative, deceptive, and they are criminal. So as an example, take this directive. It sounds like a good thing. The Obama administration issues no more torture. The Department of Defense issues an official directive. There will be no more torture, no more SEER torture. But then what you have to do is look at how a directive is written. What they do is they have a glossary that goes with every directive that defines the terms of the directive. And SEER techniques is a term in the directive, and it's in the glossary. And if you look to see what they mean by SEER techniques, they say that the SEER techniques, are those techniques that are used by SEER in their training in their training purposes that haven't already, been allowed for use elsewhere. What does that mean? Well, in fact, the Army Field Manual, which the Democrats and human rights agencies, have claimed forbids torture and replaced the CIA enhanced interrogation torture techniques, includes, guess what? Torture. It includes the SEER techniques such as solitary confinement, sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation, applying goggles and earmuffs to prisoners for hours, days, in the case of isolation, weeks and months on end, as well as other manipulative sources in combination with other official Army field manual interrogation techniques, such as one called futility, which has to do with inducing helplessness and hopelessness in prisoners, and another one called fear up, which is meant to induce great feelings of fear of harm coming to them by detainees. In other words, the program of psychological torture to break people down, which was part of the SEER training and earlier part of the CIA research into torture, going back decades, was still allowed by the United States. And the United Nations recognized this in when their Committee on Torture met a few years ago to see how the United States, they do this, they meet every 2 years and they look at different countries and see how they are complying with the Convention Against Torture, which is a UN treaty to which the United States is a signatory. And they said, hey, your Army Field Manual allows abuse amounting to torture. And they singled out and specifically the sensory deprivation and sleep deprivation aspects of the current Army Field Manual. Unfortunately, this was ignored by almost everybody. And but this is what's out there. You know, why is it ignored by everybody? Wow, I wish I knew the answer to that. I think it's a complex question, and its answer would be complex. But I want your listeners to know just how intricate, how simple questions and their answers, in fact, lead into a web of deception and lies by the U.S. government. And in many cases, it is facilitated by the mainstream media, but even so-called progressive bloggers, human rights organizations, etc., who know better, but for whatever their own reasons are, choose to remain silent.
Well, I think your book, when we start to talk about the cases in your book, we'll see just how deep the secrecy of these things go. Look at the flaws in record keeping at the camp. Look at failures in standard operating procedure there. So what is going on there now? We've seen, as I understand, just from my limited knowledge of what's in the news, we've seen a lot of people maybe sent back to their home countries. How many people are still in Guantanamo Bay? And then can you also talk about the Trump administration and some of Trump's comments on torture and what it looks like, whether he will start sending new people to Guantanamo Bay?
Right. Well, I don't have the absolute figures at my fingertips, but I believe it's approximately 41 prisoners, maybe it's 45, are still at Guantanamo. Roughly a dozen of them are so-called high-value detainees who are being tried by the military commissions. Some 20 or so have been cleared for release by the U.S. government, by their own procedures, and yet remain, they can't be released. Why? The U.S. government says for security reasons. And so here's people who they've never been charged with anything, they've never been convicted of anything. The U.S. government even says they don't represent a threat, and yet they remain in indefinite detention at Guantanamo. Now, one thing the Obama administration did do was continue the policy, although albeit more slowly, that the Bush administration had already engaged in the closing years of its administration, of its 8 years in power, and we're releasing hundreds of Guantanamo detainees over the years, and Obama continued to do that, albeit very slowly. But by reducing the detainee population now to well under 100, what's happened, of course, is that the spotlight upon Guantanamo and the sense of massive human rights violations occurring, has fallen off the radar. And in many ways, the Obama administration is to blame for that because they determinedly, after the Bush administration left office, said that they would not prosecute torture that had occurred there. They weren't going to pursue it. They weren't going to investigate it. That we needed to look forward, not back. So what's happening now is some 3 to 4 dozen people are still maintained there. The military commissions continue, and they're in the news it seems I was going to say daily, not really daily, but monthly. And most recently, I said daily because literally just yesterday and the day before, the defense team, the civilian defense team for the detainee Al-Nashiri, who was supposedly on trial for the bombing of the USS Cole in the year 2000, resigned en masse. In fact, they were allowed to resign en masse because the military head of the defense portion of the Military Commission said they had no choice but to stop defending this client because it would be unethical to continue under the current circumstances. What were the current circumstances? That's classified. But we understand to a certain extent that it had to do with compromised attorney-client communications that where intelligence agencies, and by that I assume it's the CIA, are listening in repeatedly or compromising the defense for these people. Whether they're doing it to get, Al-Nashiri, who's been in prison for almost 17 years, has to offer intelligence agencies at this point, I don't know. But it would seem to me they're intending to sabotage the trials in certain cases because the military commissions were established to provide show trials for the U.S. government, and when a show trial can't take place, then they will just sabotage it and keep these people there forever for propaganda value, because Al-Nashiri does remain a propaganda chess piece because here he's put forth constantly as the mastermind of the Cole bombing, and he's in prison, and and so that whole narrative stays out there. The attorneys who resigned just the other day put out a press release. The press release was never published online except by one other Gitmo attorney, Candace Gorman, on her blog, the Gitmo blog it's called, published it just the other day. And even though it was reported by big-time reporter Carol Rosenberg at Miami Herald, she didn't quote certain portions of the press release. And the most interesting one I saw, someone passed it along to me. Well, actually, I could have seen it also on Candace's blog, but I only found out about that later, was that the attorneys claimed that these things are being done to cover up the truth about what happened in the Cole bombing. Now, that's very interesting. And as well as the torture of Al-Nashiri, who was mentioned in the Senate CIA torture report that came out a few years ago. So we know a lot about that already. But to me, what's most important is that the USS Cole, the charges that the truth about the Cole bombing are being kept. What is that truth? I don't know. But it's probably that Al-Nashiri really wasn't involved at all. And that's my understanding, is that he really is a patsy in this. And one of the people in the book, by the way, Cover Up at Guantanamo, who supposedly was a suicide, and that is Abdul Rahman Al-Amri, was in fact, at one point, the U.S. military claimed that he had done a video about the Cole bombing and was facilitating how to instruct people how to bomb a ship. It turned out later they had to pull back on that. It wasn't Al-Amri that did any such thing. And that's just an example of how these terror events have been used or either misused through terrible intelligence and inept investigations, or used as propaganda instruments to spread false stories and narratives, something the military itself calls denial and deception, to put out false narratives out there into the public so that they can facilitate U.S. policy. So anyway, I've gone off on a tangent, but that's the kind of thing that's happening at Guantanamo right now, to show you how injustice still is a major component of what Guantanamo is about.
Right. Well, when you say, you remind us that these men have been in there for 17 years, some are deemed not a threat at all, and yet they're still kept there. Could hardly be anything less just than that.
Yes.
Before we actually start talking about the cases in your book, I wonder if I can just read a short list of places in the camp, and you can just briefly tell us what they are, so people kind of have a glossary of the camp before we start. So,
okay.
Camp 5. Now, I guess Guantanamo is broken up into different camps. Can you tell us what Camp 5 is?
Yeah, Camp 5 was a major detention facility built along the lines of a supermax prison where, at least originally, high-value, so what they called high-value detainees were placed in solitary confinement. And and by the way, it's been closed now. Camp 5 is no longer in operation. For one thing, of course, obviously, there are not hundreds of detainees anymore. They did. But Camp 5 was a major place where prisoners were sent for, imprisonment under solitary confinement. And the detainees, some of them, of course, who committed suicide there, such as Amri, but also another one in as late as 2012, Adnan Al-Latif, had in fact killed themselves or were murdered or whatever in Camp 5. So it was a major place, and Amnesty International and other organizations documented the intense cruelty of conditions in that camp.
It was sort of the punishment camp, is that correct? Or is compared to the other ones, it was harsher than...
There were other ones. There was Camp Echo, which you may have told me, which was very deep solitary confinement. And there's Camp 6, which is still in operation today, of which I believe, and I could be wrong, this Camp Echo was part of Camp 6.
Oh, okay.
But the other part of it is had allowed for some communal detention, if you were in better behavior or whatever they were, for whatever reasons. Camp 6, for the most part, was used for people who were in less harsh detention. There was a camp for a while, often now long out of commission, called Camp Iguana, which was used for adolescent or child detainees. And that was later transformed into a place where attorneys and their clients could meet, supposedly confidentiality, but that turned out not to be true, during the military commissions. And then, of course, earlier, maybe you were going to mention these Camp X-Ray sometimes gets mentioned. That was the initial setup for detainees in 2002, and where people might remember from the famous press clippings where they were literally put in wire cages. The entire complex, to make things more confusing, is called Camp Delta.
Okay.
And then finally, there was a CIA black site, possibly even a JSOC, joint black site on somewhere on the grounds of Guantanamo Naval Base. The CIA complex was known colloquially as Camp No among the people there, like, no, it doesn't exist. And later it was a press, it's escaping my memory now, but it was reported in the press, I believe by AP, that it was called it was called Strawberry Fields it was its code name. This was because the CIA was all over Guantanamo as well. They were both in the regular interrogation booths at Camp 5, Camp 6, etc. They also had their own black site.
And who actually is... I mean, you are talking in your book, the FBI is there, the CIA is there, but who is actually... Is it the Army running the camp? Who actually runs the camp?
Well, it's run by what's called Joint Task Force. It's a Navy base, and the Navy has responsibility for the base, and the base commander is usually some kind of admiral. But the Army, I believe, is running a lot of the detention center component of it, although along with other members of the military services, including the Marines and the Navy itself. So the guards, for instance, there are Navy guards at Guantanamo, there are Army guards. When the detainees died there, there was mandated to be two types of investigation. One was by the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, that's NCIS, and the other was for the Army, in fact, who had to put out a something called an AR-15 investigatory report as well on the deaths. And there are other authorities who had some presence at the camp from the military side, in particular the JAGs, or who were under the the joint, all these. After a while, I get, my mind gets jumbled with all the alphabet soup of the different agencies. But one should know that early on in Guantanamo, something known as the CITF, the Criminal Investigative Task Force, which included people from the military services, were doing criminal interrogations of Guantanamo prisoners. One of those people, who was in charge by the name of Mark Fallon, who had long been with NCIS, is coming out with a book very shortly called Unjustifiable Means. I believe it's going to be published within a few weeks, after battling the government over the censorship of what he has to say. And, he's going to document as best he can, the torture that took place at Guantanamo, the fight against it, and even, I believe, ongoing torture that takes place. So there was the CITF, but also there was the FBI was there. The CIA was there. There was just a lot of, the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. There were, who knows what other intelligence agencies. A lot of people running around Guantanamo. And to make matters worse, they weren't always who they seemed to be. In particular, some of the DIA investigators apparently masqueraded themselves as FBI. The CIA long has had people working in the military under military cover in certain instances, predating Guantanamo, but also there, where they, in fact, it might be a military person or really it's a CIA person undercover. So they were, at one point, to give you a little taste of it, one of the stories related in my book, a guard tells NCIS that he heard the call that there was an emergency with one of the detainees, and he went running to the cell block, the cell tier where the detainee was. It was on Camp 5, and he runs into a guy who's not wearing a name tag like you're supposed to have, and he goes, "Who are you?" And the guy just doesn't tell him and runs on. and he doesn't, okay. He just gets caught up in the emergency of it all, goes to help out with the discovered body. But it's just an example that people are running around Guantanamo, and you don't always even know who they are. And this, by the way, is an extremely high security environment. So the fact that people could move around without identification at Guantanamo is extraordinary.
Well, it definitely sounds like the kind of place where almost anything could happen just out of the whole situation, and certainly anything could happen to the people there. So let's start going through the cases that you outline in your book. These are the deaths of 3 detainees. So maybe we can just start in the order.
Mm-hmm.
The first, Abdul Rahman Al Amri. Can you tell us about his background in the Saudi army and how he got sent to Guantanamo Bay?
Yeah, he was I should say sometimes some of the details of his biography are speculative. Even though they're reported, I cannot say I trust entirely things that were said. They come from government. A lot of it comes from government documents that are contradictory and again could represent false stories. So what I'm saying, I'm a little cagey about certain aspects. It's not because it's because I am not certain that the sources are truthful.
Sure.
These are government sources. But Al Amri was an officer in the Saudi army. He trained with Americans in the 1990s. His brother was apparently was a high-ranking member of the Saudi army as well. And one of the stories put out by the military is that I feel there might be some truth to this, was that, and I think Al Amri did say this too at one point in a hearing, that he got into drugs and was not very religious, and then had a kind of religious awakening that took place in the late 1990s. And when the Taliban came to power, felt attracted to them and felt that it was his duty to go fight for jihad in the sense of what the Taliban was doing. And the government claims he became involved. He went to Afghanistan, although the exact time he arrived is contradictory. Perhaps as early as 2000, perhaps as late as mid-2001. or late 2001. And supposedly, government, he was allied himself with Al Qaeda. And at one point, at one of his hearings, though, at one point the government claimed that he had knowledge of 9/11, and in fact had been recruited by one of the terrorists who had died in 9/11 in the planes. But later they withdrew that, and they seemed to just drop the story that he had prior knowledge of 9/11. They just dropped it, and probably because it wasn't true. And I go into that more in detail in the book. And Al Amri told a military his combatant review hearing that he had no desire to kill Americans, and that if he had a desire to kill Americans, he had plenty of opportunity when he trained with them in the Saudi military. Now, whether that's disingenuous or true or whatever, we don't know. But anyway, that's his past. He was captured, as many of them were, after the Battle of Tora Bora. He was captured by the Pakistanis. I do not know the circumstances of his capture. But he was turned over by Pakistani authorities, in any case, to the United States and sent to Guantanamo in early 2002, and where he remained until his death in late May of 2007.
And so tell us, I guess, take us to how he died, and then maybe give us a government story of how he died, and then start going through how you began to unearth some of this stuff. And this could be a good time also to say, a little bit about how you yourself got involved in investigating these cases.
Sure. And I go into some of that in the book as well, how I got involved. But the government story was always, it was very minimal. That Al Amri had killed himself with materials available to him in his cell. And that was it. Although, interestingly, there was a press report very early on, right after the death was reported by the military, in which the commander at Guantanamo said that they had initiated 2 investigations. One of them was, of course, into how he died, and the other was into possibility of guard participation, or what degree guards participated in this event. Well, we never heard anything more about that second investigation, and when I queried the Department of Defense about it, they didn't bother to reply. And in fact, in general, they never reply to me about anything I've asked on these cases, period. They will reply to me. I've discovered in other cases, particularly recently when I was wrong about something. They replied to document and explain how I was wrong, but other times where they just don't reply, and I take that to be a kind of backhanded, recognition that what I'm saying is correct or I'm on the right track. So Al Amri, so we didn't know how he died until finally his autopsy report. Initially, an autopsy report was released on his death. It's part of a general slew of documents released on to the ACLU in one of their lawsuits, but the ACLU never reported anything about it, and no one else did either. I found it myself going through those documents one by one over a period of time, and I was shocked to find in it, oh my, what's this? An autopsy report. And the autopsy report claimed that he had in fact had hanged himself in his cell by a jerry-rigged rope made from his bed sheets, and he reportedly had his hands were loosely tied behind him, and they said that they ruled that he died of suicide. So I was kind of astounded by this. I also thought it was kind of odd that a person would kill themselves and tie their hands behind their back. Isn't even an easy thing to do. I don't know if anyone's ever tried it, but if you do it, you probably do a crappy job of it. And no wonder the bindings were considered to be loosely bound. Interestingly enough, this was a year, of course, after 3 other detainees had died, supposedly also by hanging themselves in their cells. 3, all at the same time. Their hands too had been bound in front of them, but bound, as well as a cloth mask covering their face and rags apparently stuffed down their throats, at least of two of them for sure. And it was almost a year later to the day, not quite, but within a day or two, that Al Amri was found dead, hanged in his cell with his hands bound. And or was he found, or was he killed in his cell? Well, so I don't know. There were a lot of questions. I filed an Federal Freedom of Information Act request looking for the NCIS, which is the primary investigatory agency in this kind of matters, for their, for all the materials that they gathered in the context of his death. And it took me a long time to get them. And when I first got them last year, I filed on him and on Mohammed Al Hanashi, another prisoner who died in suspicious circumstances in 2009. And there were some 500 or so, 580 pages on the Al Amri case, but I only got 63 of them or something. And those were pretty redacted as well. So there really wasn't much more to add about the Al Amri case. But I persisted, and earlier this year, I finally got the other 500 or so pages, necessitating me to greatly expand my initial book on cover-up at Guantanamo, particularly around the Al Amri case. And what I found out showed that there had been, his hands, number one, were not loosely bound behind him, but they were snugly bound behind them. We know this from the fact of the guard's testimony to NCIS, who had, in fact, been the person who removed those hand bindings at the instruction of medical personnel. We found out that he had these bed sheets were tied up to a vent over 8 feet up above the ground, and that there was no way Al Amri could reach those bed sheets. I mean, reach that grating by himself. He's only stood 5.5 feet tall. Even with his hands over his head on his tippy toes, he could not reach 8 feet or more above his head. So they looked at ways he might have done this, and the vent was made of tiny little holes, the size or smaller of a ball, the big ballpoint pen I now have in my hand. And he had threaded, suppose somebody, or he or somebody threaded, ripped portions of a bed sheet through 10 different holes from one portion of a sheet, and then tied that portion of a sheet to another portion of a sheet, which he then wrapped around his neck and hanged himself, presumably. But the NCIS report on the death scene, which I was able to obtain as part of all these documents, and by the way, it and all the documents that I have that we discuss here and that the book are based on, I published and I posted online for free at GuantanamoTruth.com. It's like all one word, GuantanamoTruth.com. Anyone can go there and download or look at these documents for themselves. And according to the death scene investigator, Al Amri might have been able to reach the vent above his head, and you can get a look at what that might look like at photos I only recently discovered. This is even after the publication of the book, that I posted in an article at medium.com that show that the venting, because the government, they censored all the pictures they took from the death scene. I've appealed that, but so far I have no pictures. But a picture of another cell, a general detainee cell, shows the vent with its tiny, tiny, minuscule holes high up on the wall by the ceiling, and that the investigator could not understand how Al Amri could have done it. It was high above his head. It would have taken a long time to manufacture such a death apparatus, and we have to remember that these detainees were under near constant surveillance, that they were looked in upon at a minimum of every 3 minutes or so. There was probably also video surveillance, and so how was it done? Well, they looked and said, well, maybe he stood upon the sink or the toilet, which is made of these metal portions in the cell. Maybe he stood up on them and could reach the vent and do it. Because we're not talking about the time or the surveillance, just was it physically possible. But they looked at that and said, there's dust on these things, and there's no footprints. Actually, they did find one footprint on the toilet seat, but it was covered with dust, which is even more interesting. Why was there a footprint on the toilet seat? Why was it? It takes a while to cover with dust. Anyway, he hadn't done that. They thought, they speculated that perhaps he had taken a fold over, like a futon, if you will, kind of mattress, and folded it over and stood upon that. He might have been able to reach at least up to where the vent was. But the mattress was not near where he was. There was no evidence on the mattress that he had stood on it or there was any kind of use of the mattress for that purpose. So even though they believed that he killed himself and they speculated on how, they in fact had no evidence. And then they did something extraordinary. They withheld the fact that his hands were bound snugly behind him from all the executive summaries that they provided for months on end to Guantanamo and NCIS authorities back in Mayport, Florida, and then they did something else extraordinary. They never sent these materials back to be forensically examined, the hand bindings, and in another portion of a bed sheet that presumably was cut away was also missing, supposedly thrown out with medical trash. And even though they claimed that they saved the medical trash and made an exhibit of it in their, they never sent that for forensic examination. And when other items that were sent for forensic examination, such as the bedsheet rope, which had some sort of foreign hairs supposedly entwined, they even though the Armed Forces medical examiners asked if they wanted, NCIS wanted them to do forensic examination, they said no, under the circumstances we don't want that. What circumstances they meant, I don't know, but they scotched, forensic examination. They determined he had killed himself, and that was just going to be it, no matter what. And then there was the question, finally, of the timeline of Al-Amri. So not only how could he have done it, but what was he doing? And the other extraordinary finding that I discovered was that, and this leads into a discussion around Guantanamo, the way in which movements, activities of both detainees and Guantanamo personnel are recorded at Guantanamo on a computer logging system known as the Detainee Information Management System, or DIMS,
right?
DIMS. And the DIMS showed that in fact Al-Amri had been in interrogation literally minutes before he was found dead. Well, that's quite extraordinary. And what was even more bizarre is that supposedly he left for interrogation, went to interrogation, came back to interrogation within a matter of a few minutes. But really what had happened was the DIMS clerk who enters these things into the computer system knew that Al-Amri was supposed to go to the interrogation, had no idea if it had happened. They're not watching the detainees themselves. They're getting reports about them. Although there are video, although who knows, because there's a video feed apparently into the DIMS facility, which is part of what's called control. Sounds like Get Smart, control room at Guantanamo. And so the DIMS clerk, who was a data entry clerk essentially, uncertain that Al-Amri had returned to his cell, contacted the commander of the guards, the guard commander, who's a woman, and said, I don't know, did this happen? Was the movement completed? This is the term, bureaucratic language they use. And the guard commander said, yes, the movement has been concluded, meaning he had returned to his cell from interrogation. But here's the extraordinary thing. When, according to a camp linguist, Al-Amri canceled his meeting to see the interrogator hours before in the morning because of bad hemorrhoids. And even more extraordinary, a separate story emerges from the purported interrogator himself, who told NCIS that he was going to go to who was never told that Al-Amri apparently had canceled his interrogation. Instead, he was told that there weren't sufficient interpreters. There was no interpreter for him at that time, and then the interrogator, canceled the interrogation that was supposed to take place around 10 a.m. on the morning Al-Amri died. Al-Amri was discovered around 12:30 p.m. during lunchtime. And but the DIMS, which records what happens and when, at least you're supposed to enter it, that's the standard operating procedure. I mean, if the detainee spits at you, you record it in DIMS. If he gets medications, you record it in DIMS. If he's moved from his cell at all, you record it in DIMS, right? If he starts making a speech and he starts crying, you report it in DIMS. Everything is recorded in Guantanamo, everything. And it's reported and recorded. And the guard, amazingly, Al-Amri's cancellation of his so-called cancellation of his interrogation was never recorded. Then the interrogator says, "Oh, there's no interpreter," and the cancellation of the interrogation for lack of interpreter is also never recorded in DIMS. But what is in DIMS is that he went to the interrogation. So they asked the guard commander, NCIS, "Hey, do you know whether or not?" They asked this of a number of people if Al-Amri ever left his cell that morning, and her response was, "I don't know. You'll have to consult the DIMS," which is interesting because it's in the DIMS, and certainly the guard commander could not have forgotten that literally the day before, or 2 days before, I'm not sure which as I speak to you now, but literally that the DIMS clerk had called them up or contacted them somehow within the camp prior to his death and asked them if he had returned from interrogation, and the guard commander told them yes to DIMS. The reason was to record it in DIMS. So when he says look at DIMS, or she said look at DIMS, I take that to mean, look, I'm not going to go on the record telling you I know that he was in interrogation because this is something really weird is going down here, but just look in DIMS, okay? So they did, and but they just let it pass. They just did nothing with that. NCIS. They just said we don't see anything strange here at all. Was there, nothing weird is happening here, and so that was a very short version of some of the amazing things I found out about Al-Amri's death.
Well, the DIMS is a kind of an interesting thing because it's almost in each case you discuss there are problems with this, and it's almost interesting. I found it interesting that its creation was basically by some low-level person at the camp who I guess had some computer skills and was told to create this thing, but it wasn't part of any larger system. And you found in another case that information had just basically been deleted from it. That's the case of Al Hanashi. Should we talk a little about Al Hanashi and
sure
what happened to him?
Right. Well, that and in the context of the DIMS, as you'll see, you're right. The DIMS, some kind of manipulate. You're right. The person who I tracked down and spoke to, was the program manager for the development of the detainee information management system. The story goes that when General Jeffrey, maybe you can think of it, Miller, of course, came to Guantanamo, who had very little expertise apparently in prison operations, nevertheless, tried to found things quite chaotic when he arrived at Guantanamo. And one of the things they tried to do, and also I happen to know that higher military authorities looking at claims about what had happened at Guantanamo in terms of abuse of detainees, also determined that there should be computerized, there should be some tightening up of of being able to say what was happening to detainees, where were they, there was very poor record keeping, and so however it happened, and according to Adam Foreman, who went on the record for me on this, he was he was a non-commissioned officer who had been in the Guard Force, but did have expertise. In fact, today still works as an IT. had expertise in computers and was made the program manager. Now, whether that's the person, that doesn't mean he was the one ultimately in charge, but it means he had a significant responsibility, to follow through and know something about computer security. And he also knows how the program was developed and what it looked like. So he was able to tell me, back to Hanashi. This will be relevant in a second. Mohammed Al Hanashi was from Yemen. He was a young man when he was captured on the battlefield. It's a long story as to how he made his way to Guantanamo, but he was at Guantanamo. He was a longtime hunger striker. He had gained some authority among the prisoners. A man apparently had some leadership skills, but he was also, from very early on, became quite suicidal and disturbed at Guantanamo. And Guantanamo authorities themselves said this had to do with the so-called, quote, conditions of confinement, which is a euphemism for, of course, the torture conditions happening at that site. The solitary confinement, all the different torture that was happening at Guantanamo drove many of these people really quite insane. The and you can read about this in certain detainee accounts, how they battled insanity at Guantanamo that have been published. But and accounts of human rights agencies and medical groups as well that talked about this. Well, anyway, he was very upset, and anyway, he was supposedly strangled himself to death, not hung himself, literally, supposedly tore off the elastic from his briefs, and in the few minutes while he wasn't being observed under the near constant surveillance, strangled himself to death in a cell in the behavioral health unit, which is like the psych ward at Guantanamo, which was attached to Camp 5. The detention hospital, which is attached to very close to Camp 5. When he was found, somebody ordered, and I was the one person to report this, and in fact, so far as I know, I'm the only person to still report this. The indifference to these cases by the mainstream press and people who I otherwise even respect for some of their reporting and their activism is just outstanding, boggles my mind. In any case, what happened was, upon the discovery of his body, reportedly an NCIS official, although the NCIS says nobody owned up to this, but so reportedly an NCIS officer, agent themselves at the scene of death, ordered that the DIMS recording be stopped, that nothing be entered into the DIMS at all from this point onward. And which, of course, goes totally against standard operating procedures. Adam Foreman, the former project manager for DIMS, said an NCIS officer never would have had the authority to do that. He believed if it was ordered at all, it probably came from a CIA official. That's his belief. In any case, I don't know who did that. No one knows who did it. When NCIS really tried to close the Al Hanashi case, NCIS authorities back at headquarters said, well, we still have some questions here. Well, what's this about the DIMS being turned off? We want you to look into this. So a separate investigation, a sub-investigation, if you will, went into this, and they tried to track down who made who ordered this, and everyone denied it. So the next thing they did is they said, well, let's figure out who made the very last entry, right? And then we can go from there. We'll find out who the last person was to make an entry on Al Hanashi, and maybe that will be able to. We can ask them what they know. And they went to the guard force, and the guard force said, well, we don't know who made the last entry. We can't tell you because it turns out that in fact, the last 3 entries about Al Hanashi were all made on a so-called default, so they called it a default account, meaning that any person could have gone and entered in the entry about what he did, and it was things like went to sleep, called for a nurse, took medications, that anyone could have entered these things. We don't know who it was. Sorry, we can't help you. Which to me sounds like total cover-up. And so NCIS, duly reported that. and that was the kind of the end of the story. They never were able to find out, and the truth was, and when they tried to look into it, they couldn't even determine who made the last entries on Al Hanashi because, well, they were entered by anonymously, which is totally against standard operating procedure. Would be if, and I believe that too. I thought, well, okay, that's bizarre, default account. Okay, until I spoke to Mr. Foreman, and he said, what? There's no default account. That's impossible. That goes totally against cybersecurity. You would never allow, and if you just think about it with common sense, and I thought about it for a second, and probably any IT security specialist would tell you this, you would never present in a high security environment a default account where anyone could just go and log in. You wouldn't know who it was. He thought that was bizarre. Even the claim was bizarre. Obvious. So what it means to me is the guard command lied about what happened. They lied about there being a default account. Now there was one other account. An administrator always has an account, but according to the former project manager for DIMS, that administrative knowledge of the administrative account was limited to literally a handful, maybe 3 or 4 individuals who were administrators or had that kind of level of privilege. Right? We know this. Even when you get a computer these days, there are levels of you have privilege, right? And you can have other people have different, even into your own computer. So I think listeners can understand.
Sure.
So, but there are anonymous ways. I could log in as a guest to my computer, but you can't log in as a guest to a Guantanamo computer if you're working inside Guantanamo. It makes no sense. So, to amplify the subterfuge, after I filed my FOIA request on Al Hanashi, and unbeknownst to me, even though I did this in 2012 and Al Hanashi died in 2009, the investigation on Al Hanashi was still open 3 years later. I didn't know that. That's kind of bizarre. All the other investigations closed much more quickly. And subsequently, I received from NCIS FOIA office an official notice that all of the DIMS records from the behavioral health unit for the day Al Hanashi died and the day afterwards were now missing. They were gone. I mean, so a high security place like Guantanamo, you'd have to have access to the computer to destroy these records, assuming they were destroyed and you couldn't be recovered, which I'm sure they probably could have been. Or who knows, maybe not. Maybe the people who did the destruction were really, really good. It is also possible, one other possibility is that someone inside Guantanamo, or say an intelligence agency of some sort, like say the CIA or the NSA, hacked into the detainee information management system at Guantanamo, allowing manipulations to take place. Now, here's where it goes back.
It does remind us a little bit of how the CIA going onto the Senate's servers and quote unquote retrieving their torture report back from the U.S. Senate.
Right.
So, sorry, go ahead.
Yes. So right. Also, exactly right. So many. There are many different possibilities here. And but why would the CIA be interested in Al Hanashi? Why would the CIA be interested in any of this? Well, my hypothesis, and I go into this somewhat in the book, is that in fact Guantanamo was a major site of experimentation upon detainees. A major site of medical and other torture experimentation happening. And I document a number of different, I guess you could call them circumstantial, but maybe they're not because they're outright evidence of discussions and of research going on detainees that have occurred, many of them, not just one or two, but many. And I discuss them in the book. I mean, and some of this is with CIA individuals, and some of it is DOD, and recently, I'm not the only person who thinks this for sure. The Physicians for Human Rights has put out 2 reports, trying to document how experiments on torture were taking place, although they've limited their discussion to the high-value detainees held in black site prisons. I'm saying that a good deal of research took place at Guantanamo, and I can document at least discussion of that taking place, not the actual research itself. But that might explain why the CIA was interested. Another line and there were many experiments. So another one possibly had to do with the use, for instance, of drugs in torture and on the detainees. And one of them had the former Guantanamo guard Joe Hickman, who wrote about the 2006 detainees, al-Zahrani, al-Utayabi, and Ali Abdullah Ahmed, who he believed had been killed by the CIA, really, at the black site there, and then shipped back into their cells and staged their deaths. That one of them, at least, and like Amri, who I discovered by looking again at the autopsy reports, had been tested after their deaths for the presence of the anti-malaria drug mefloquine, which has serious psychiatric and neurological side effects. In fact, has now been all but not totally banned, but put out of use by the military itself. But for which we discovered, Jason Leopold and myself and other researchers, that had been administered to all the detainees upon their admission to Guantanamo. Even though there was no malaria emergency happening there at all. And again, I've gone off on a tangent, but I'm trying to find reasons as to why they would have want to cover up the circumstances around the death of Al Hanashi and the other detainees. The DIMS record, the same so-called default account and anonymous entries anyway, occurred in the 2006 deaths of those 3 detainees. When the NCIS investigators looked at the last head counts, trying to come up with, with where these detainees, again, where was the detainee? You want to, anytime you hear people, I'm sure your listeners and you yourself have watched murder mysteries on television. Someone's dead. You try and retrace what were they doing up to the time of death, right? You want to know where they were. And you're in a prison. Okay, they should be in their cells, and so you look. How can you prove that? Well, head counts are done on the prisoners, just at every prison. It was done at Guantanamo as well. But the what I discovered was that looking at the Army's investigation of the 2006 deaths was that they admitted that the head counts had been falsified. That blew me away. You would think that would be headline news, right? 63 detainees found dead in their cells, 2006. The head count that took place just before they were found dead was falsified. Wow, headline. But no, ignored, totally ignored. And when they looked into it, the NCIS, they couldn't determine who had entered that head count and an earlier head count, which also apparently was dubious because it too was entered anonymously, i.e. through some kind of supposed default account. But really what it means is that since there was no default account, that either someone had hijacked control of Guantanamo's own computer system or was going into it after the fact and manipulating it, or they were just simply making it up. That they knew and they just lied and said, we don't know. Yeah, it's a default, we don't know, but really they did know and didn't want to release the information. Right. Which is certainly possible if, let's say, guards decided to kill the detainees. You mentioned Al Amri, so Al Amri just 2 weeks before he died had reported to the guards, reported the guard force for having oral sex outside of his prison cell. Now, whether guards were really having oral sex outside of his prison cell, I don't know. But that's a pretty extraordinary claim. And it's the kind of claim that I would imagine many young, red-blooded American guards wouldn't like to be banded around. Perhaps he was killed by guards because he was, saying things like that about them, or whether they were true or not. Who knows? All I know, and what I've tried to put forth in my research on the Guantanamo detainees, is that there is way, way more than enough evidence in play to show that the official stories that we've received are totally bogus. They have real problems. There are major holes in these investigations, and that something should be done about that. I really am pleased that you've asked me to talk about this because, I think that it's something that continues to be covered up, and the facilitation of that cover-up is happening now by the mainstream press and those people who in the media who basically don't want to do anything on their own if the New York Times and Washington Post or AP haven't indicated that that's an official line of inquiry.
Well, let's go back and talk a little bit about the drugs that are given out of the camp, because I made a short list. I didn't even get all of them.
Mm-hmm.
But you talk about as Ambien, Klonopin, Haldol, Ativan, Xanax, Mefloquine, scopolamine, Seroquel, Remeron, Celexa, Ativan, Invega, Percocet. I mean, you talk about the use of the Mefloquine as a pharmacological waterboarding. Maybe we can use this to go into the history of psychological torture and even the CIA drug experiments from the Cold War. But what, talk about the Mefloquine. How would that be used to break down a detainee?
Well, by the way, I'm not the one who came up with the term pharmacological waterboarding. That was a term used by a major doctor, Major Remington Nevin, who had been an anti-Mefloquine activist, if you will, within the military himself, because he felt that this anti-malaria drug was harming U.S. soldiers. And there are organizations out there still in play today who are trying to help many U.S. soldiers who feel they were harmed by the use of this anti-malaria drug that was developed by the U.S. military during the Vietnam War and was pushed by the U.S. military over the years for reasons that have some sense to them. That's not totally without sense. Mefloquine was a drug that only had to be administered once a week versus other anti-malaria drugs that you had to administer every day. So it certainly made things easier if it worked. Malaria is a very complex medical problem. Drugs developed for it only work for a certain period of time until the organism, the parasite, malaria parasite, through evolution, develops an immunity to it. So anyway, it's a big major military and health problem. Anyway, the Mefloquine, though, is a part of a class of drugs known as quinolines, and it turns out that the CIA during the 1950s and 60s experimented with a number of drugs, lethal drugs as well as incapacitating drugs. And one of the drugs that they stockpiled was, in fact, a cousin to Mefloquine, another quinoline anti-malarial drug. Its name escapes me at the moment, forgive me. In my old age, sometimes my memory fails me, but I'm sure people could look it up. Anyway, they used malaria drugs, the CIA, previously as incapacitating drugs. Incapacitating how? Well, through their side effects. Everyone knows that, for instance, that Benadryl is a drug that's taken if you have bad allergies. But you know what? If you take enough Benadryl, it's going to make you tired and you're going to go to sleep. Scopolamine is a drug also used for anti-emetic, for anti-nausea purposes, given to people sometimes for seasickness. But it also can have really bad side effects that make you incredibly dizzy or nauseous itself. And in fact, was tested as far back as World War II, well, earlier than World War II, as a so-called truth drug because of its delirium-inducing effects. And scopolamine was, by the way, another thing I discovered and reported on, was administered to all of the detainees who were renditioned to Guantanamo. An ear patch was put on them, and now Mefloquine, scopolamine, these are and all these drugs, they have different. And I was a medical person, I was a psychologist, but I took courses in psychopharmacology, and I had to certainly deal with many clients, hundreds of them who were on medications, and learned a lot about that. I'm not a psychiatrist, but I learned a lot. And one of the major things you learn is that there are differential effects of drugs on different individuals. And anyone who takes any medication knows this. I mean, some people say, I can take aspirin, I don't have a problem. But you, Dave, you might take aspirin, maybe you get an upset stomach, because aspirin affects your stomach that way, but not mine. So these drugs have differential effects, including drugs like Mefloquine and scopolamine. But if I give 800 people, which is about how many detainees went through Guantanamo total, Mefloquine, and I discover that 100 of them developed, bad side effects. They have nightmare. These are the kinds of side effects. Mefloquine has nightmares, dizziness, nausea, suicidal thoughts, and depression. Then now I have a new tool. I don't need, I have a drug that if I want to punish you, I just give you the mefloquine, right? Because I know what's going to make you feel bad. It's legal. It's a legal drug. And if anyone looks into your medical chart, it's just going to look like I gave you, a drug for some medical purpose. But really, I was torturing you, right?
Right.
That's how these drugs work. The other thing that the military did, and I worked with Jason Leopold, a reporter, well-known reporter on this as well, was on the use of drugs in Guantanamo, which Jody Warwick, another reporter at the Washington Post, had and some U.S. senators had made a scandal of back in 2006 because there were reports coming in as detainees were being released that they were being seriously drugged. So an inspector general investigation at the Department of Defense was initiated, and at the CIA supposedly was initiated, but turned out not really. Anyway, the DOD did do one, and what we learned from that was that, one, they would sometimes lie to prisoners about what drugs they were giving them. They lied to Jose Padilla, told him they were giving him LSD, when really they claimed they were giving him a influenza shot. The other thing they did is they called chemically restrained. That's their term, chemical restraint. Used drugs like Haldol, these major antipsychotics, similar to what's sometimes done, of course, in psychiatric hospitals, to shut down a person. Perhaps again, some of your listeners will have seen some movie or show where somebody goes out of control psychologically in a hospital, and the people, they run up and they give them a shot and suddenly collapses. Right? What's the shot? And what if you have drugs that can do that? Maybe you use it on people if they just protest. The prisoners would protest that they were being tortured. We know this, in fact, from what they've told us, but we know it also from the documents that I've retrieved via Freedom of Information Act. So we know that Al Hanashi, the very day he died, protested to the chief of the behavioral health unit that he was in, who was a psychologist apparently, that he was being tortured. And the chief, by his own word, turned on his heel and walked away from him without saying a word. And he said, that's what I always do when prisoners claim they're being tortured. Right? Well, Al Hanashi was so stunned by this, he put it in the last thing he ever wrote, which some people or DOD claimed was a suicide note, and said that he realized that from this kind of stuff that there was just no, and for some rule changes that were going to be taking place in the psych unit at the same time, that there was no hope. But whether or not he really killed himself, or whether or not he killed himself and they watched him kill himself and allowed him, or facilitated his suicide, which is what I believe. I believe in some of these cases, materials were given, and I document this in the book, and some of the Guantanamo attorneys are also helped me gather other detainee testimony to this regard, in which detainees, some of them who died, were given the materials to kill themselves because they were already desperately suicidal from the torture and hopelessness that had been induced in them, and were allowed to die. So the drugs, it's a large question. I don't know how long we're going to go on with this, but one other important aspect that your listeners should know is that when the Army, when the CIA torture protocols were supposedly turned over to this Army field manual. This was a field manual that was used, that is the one today that Dianne Feinstein and the Democratic Party and human rights groups claim today are so great. It doesn't allow torture. One of the things that this Army field manual, which was put into place in September 2006, did, and by the way, it replaced an earlier edition of the Army Field Manual on Interrogation, which itself was replaced yet an earlier one. And in each of these, in the one that predated 2006, the rules of the Army Field Manual said you could not use any drugs on prisoners that would cause psychosis. It would cause any kind of a bad reaction. But in 2006, they used, and when John Yoo was giving the CIA back in 2002, John Yoo, in the famous torture memos, guidance on how to use drugs or if they could use drugs, he said, well, you could use drugs as long as they don't cause permanent harm or create a state of mental illness like OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, or PTSD kinds of symptoms. Well, in the Army Field Manual, it became the ability to use drugs got even looser than that. You were allowed now to use drugs as long as they didn't, cause, essentially death or serious long-term disability. So you could, you could take somebody and hop them up on antipsychotic medications for days or weeks on end, and mainly have them just be essentially in a stupor, for a long time, which apparently did happen to certain detainees. I know David Hicks, the Australian detainee who was released after a plea, an Alford plea with the military commissions, many years ago, said that he was. And his book, by the way, which he published about it, was never published in the United States. So all of this around drugs is one of the murkier areas that we have. A lot of detainees have talked about it. The government denies that it used drugs, at least for the purposes of interrogation. They do admit that they used drugs during to a certain degree during the kidnapping of the prisoners to renditions to Guantanamo and elsewhere, and that they used them to restrain prisoners and drug them without their consent. And so anyway, what's of course of interest was that when the autopsy reports, the toxicology reports on some of the detainees, particularly Ali Abdullah Ahmed in 2006 and Al Amri in 2007, showed that these particular detainees were tested for the presence of methylquin. Now, which is bizarre because the other ones weren't. Were these two detainees who told them that these detainees and not others should be tested for methylquin? Were these two detainees who had proven to be sensitive to the ill effects of methylquin? Was that why they were testing for it? In 2006, by the way, and also Al Amri, they were tested for the presence of chloroquine. Chloroquine is another anti-malarial drug, by the way, that also sometimes, not as famously as methylquine, that can cause ill effects. So, why were, after being in prison for years and not exposed to malaria or anything, because there is no malaria problem in Cuba, why were these and other detainees not tested for malaria? Well, we don't have an answer to these questions, but Joe Hickman, again, who wrote on the 2006 test, believes that the methylquin was experimented upon, and Jason Leopold and I amplified on this in the articles we wrote at truthout.org about this, and believes it was part of a special access program, an SAP it's called, which is a highly, highly secret program about use of methylquin as some kind of drug to interrogate prisoners. And I believe that, certainly there were other special access programs going on at Guantanamo. And of course, if you belong to a special access program, which can draw in from many different agencies, not just one agency like the CIA, you cannot say anything about knowledge of that program, or yourself you will be prosecuted. Right? Once you're read in, that's it. You can never say anything again. And so that's how the government protects these super secret things. And people then label people like me, not that the government has done this, but some people would label people like me conspiracy theorists. Well, I didn't create a conspiracy where some secret program is taking place and you can't talk about it under pressure of being prosecuted and put in prison. Right? that I didn't create that fact, So I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm simply reporting the facts that are out there, and in such a way, to such a degree that it is, quite obvious that we are not getting the truth told to us, and the entities that could look into that, such as Congress or the courts or various human rights agencies or the press, have failed us to pursue these things. They've pursued some of these things, and perhaps that's all their editors or the CEOs of a human rights organization feel they can do. But in my belief, particularly when it comes to the deaths at Guantanamo, totally failed us. And when they've had an opportunity, have jumped on the bandwagon to, as they did against Joseph Hickman and Harper's Magazine, who reported on the 2006 deaths and Camp Nou, to bring them into disrepute, and presumably all the better to get in good with the government, or perhaps at the instigation of the government itself. We don't know.
Well, it seems like, these are people now that the government is not sure even what to do with. They can't accuse them of any crime, yet they can't let them free. So,
well, what is it? They can't let them free because to the degree in which they can talk, and some of them have gotten free and talked, such as Lakhdar Bumed. What's his name? Just came out with a book.
Shakar Amr, or?
Well, Shakar Amr could be. I think that he does have a book that's going to be coming out. But at Guantanamo, I can't believe it. I'll get his name here in a second. He was from Algeria. Anyway, there's been books published by detainees, and these books are politically damaging. To the government. One of them that came out not very long ago was a Guantanamo Diary by a so-called high-value detainee who finally got released, Mohammed Al Hanashi, who was tortured at Guantanamo with sear techniques, and his Guantanamo Diary became one of the few that really broke through and became a bestseller, thanks to really the ACLU and the people who worked on that book, as editors, etc. So, and that's an example where the media really did do some good, and but it's as if they can only take one thing at a time. They can take one man's account of his rendition and torture at Guantanamo, and that's all they really have room for on their plate. And you can see from discussing with me where I could go on and on and on. Maybe it's just overwhelming how much crime has really taken place, and it's hard when you just think of the amount of U.S. crimes in general, far beyond those of just Guantanamo or even torture, that go back, war crimes that go back to the Korean War, or the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where most people don't even know that, for instance, that the U.S. Made it impossible for victims of that, or refused rather to treat the victims of that bombing who survived, and instead studied them as research objects of what happens after atomic bombings, to the degree that some, at least one famous Japanese figure, felt that the Hiroshima took place not to end the war was going to end anyway, but it took place so that the U.S. had a chance to experiment and see what really happened, if you dropped an atomic bomb on a civilian population. And so anyway, there's, one could go on and on and on. This is the world we live in, a world of tremendous crime, tremendous lies. And I certainly, you asked me how I got into this. I got into this because I feel for the integrity of who I am, and I discovered that as I go into the book a little bit. I worked. A friend of mine asked me to work for an agency he was heading at the time, which was a local torture treatment center in San Francisco, California, Survivors International. And I began to work with torture victims, not victims of U.S. torture, but torture of other regimes, some of them U.S. allies, some not, from around the world who had come to the United States seeking political asylum to escape persecution. And as I began to work, and it wasn't the first time I had ever worked with a torture victim. In my training, in my work, I'd come across a few other people. Are you there?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd come across a few other people who had been tortured, one from Poland, another one in El Salvador. And, so I knew it existed, but as I got more and more into it, and I started doing forensic examinations for them to help them with their legal asylum cases, I became more involved emotionally, I guess you could say, professionally with the issue of torture. And then when news of U.S. torture and psychologists' participation in developing U.S. torture started to leak out in the mid to early 2000s, I became part of, like a lot of my colleagues, a certain amount of them, incensed by this. And my way of dealing with it was to look into it more from a research standpoint, and discovered that because of my interest in history, I taught history of psychology, for instance, and my undergraduate, I was a history major at UC Berkeley, and I said, let's look at, this come out of nowhere. And when I looked into it and read people like Alfred McCoy, who I believe you posted, some interviews with him or at your own website, that I heard him speak in Berkeley back in 2007, I think, and found that, wow, there's this old history about this. This didn't come out of nowhere. What's going, and I was just kind of amazed. I was not traumatized. I was maybe I was somewhat vicariously traumatized, but I was stunned, and I felt that I should do something. And my research and my writing has been my way, at least, of trying to do something about this.
Right, and I think it's a great book for watching you try to dig through the truth of what has happened to some people who, for all intents and purposes, have nobody out there looking out for them.
Yes.
Is there anything else that you want to add before we go?
No, I feel I've touched on many things. I think your listeners their minds will be spinning at this point.
Well, let people know the name again of your book, and tell them the name of your blog, at least, so that and we'll put a bunch of links in to the YouTube comments. But
well, the name of my blog is Invictus, like the famous poem, INVICTUS, at valtinsblog.blogspot.com. Although lately I've been posting at medium.com, and you could search for Jeffrey Kaye at that website. The name of my book is Cover Up at Guantanamo, the NCIS investigation into the, quote, suicides of Mohammed Al Hanashi and Abdul Rahman Al Amri, which you can buy as an ebook or a paperback at Amazon.com. And the documents this is all based on can be found at GuantanamoTruth.com. And I also have a Facebook page, which is Facebook is /Guantanamo Truth, all one word, where I post other things that might be of interest and other ways if listeners wanted to comment to me or get a hold of me.
Great. Thanks for talking to me. I hope, actually, if you're interested, I think we could do a whole talk really digging into the history of this kind of psychological torture and the CIA experiments over the years. So, hopefully, if you're interested, we could do that sometime.
Yes, that would be, of course, looking at Project Artichoke, MK Ultra, and many, of the experiments that were done, and the whole. It goes back to the very first. To the whole question of whether or not torture took place. Well, anyway, I won't even go into this. It takes us all the way back, really, to the Korean War and events that occurred there. And they're very important because, of course, the U.S. conflict with North Korea is, I'm sure your listeners know, very much in the news today, if not in our nightmares. And really, a lot of this all begins there. But that's for another story, another time.
Well, yeah, I'd love to talk about that and go all the way up to, Mr. Mitchell or Doctors Mitchell and Jessen here and talk about, you wrote a great article with Jason Leopold called CIA Psychologist Notes Reveal the True Purpose Behind Bush's Torture Program, and I'll put links to all this stuff there, but I'd love to talk to you about that as well. So maybe we can plan for another time, but thank you very much for talking about your book today.
Sure, thank you.
This is Our Hidden History